And just starting a new thing called Intern Night Float. And I was the first intern at the University of Minnesota chosen to be the first intern night floater. And I won't blame anyone, Jeff Chipman, for this decision. But apparently I was chosen that would be my first rotation here at Minnesota. I got here around 4:30 in the afternoon to start the handing off process, and for the next hour or so, I was handed a series of about 100 patients on these ugly Word document lists with little notes scribbled here and there. And I remember Vikas Dudeja coming in and handing me the Surgeonc list which was pretty nice and tidy, and him just telling me, you'll want to quit about 30 times before it's morning, but just stick with it. It'll be okay. And here I am today. That that sort of seminal experience with the handoff process and the handoff note really informed my decision making when I was doing my advanced training in informatics, and actually that was the crux of my PhD thesis work. Um, it eventually morphed into what you guys now use in Epic as the right handoff tool. So, for better or worse, I was responsible for that. And it's been in use pretty consistently since then, until maybe this past month you noticed some changes to the tool for you more junior residents or APPs who use it more frequently for handoff. And that all has to do with the fact that we are now embracing and implementing the IPASS mnemonic and the IPASS strategy for patient handoffs here at the University of Minnesota. So I'm just going to talk to you, hopefully very briefly, about that today. So just really quick, failures in communication are responsible for way more patient events, lawsuits, and problems in inpatient acute care than they should be. These are errors that are not due to bad medical decision making or difficult cases like the one we just did. Um, these are solely errors in communication where a probably good plan just wasn't enacted, or key information that we all should have known wasn't appropriately passed on. We know here at UMMC there are a lot of communication errors, and a lot of sentinel events could have been prevented when the root cause analysis was done and showed a communication event as the area of improvement. When we surveyed our house staff and APPs, this is mostly junior residents and APPs, we found that they have a relatively high perception that there is some harm being done, mostly minor harms, but some major harms to patients when they've been surveyed the past few months. So why structure a handoff? Well, in all honesty, you've all been probably utilizing the elements of the IPASS mnemonic already in your handoffs, especially the more thorough ones that you do. I've heard you give handoffs; they're pretty good. What the IPASS structure essentially does is it organizes everything into more of a shared mental model and a more consistent flow of information that you can depend on when you're giving handoff or when you're receiving it. Um, and so, uh, right again, going back to 2016, I did an initial study of the handoff processes we were using at UMMC. There was just a collection of documents, mostly Word or Excel files. There was a lot of inconsistency and a lot of work having to be done and redone because of the lack of automation. If you want to look up that article from the Journal of Health Informatics, you could be the third person to download it. So what is IPASS? So the mnemonic stands for illness severity, and IPASS structures this into three categories: stable, watcher, and unstable. Patient summary, which should be a pretty, pithy, straightforward one or two liner, similar to the one you would be giving in your assessment and plan to a chief resident or attending when you're rounding. The action list of to-do items for the next day or evening shift, situal awareness, and contingency planning. So these are your if then patients. So if creatinine comes back at 3, consult nephrology, stuff like that. And then finally, it adds an element which we probably lack somewhat in our own processes of synthesis by the receiver. So, giving the opportunity for the person receiving that information to come back to you with their summary of what has just been told to them. And that allows for the opportunity for questions as well. So, they did some some studies, some observations of us doing our handoffs the past few months. And in general, we're pretty much hitting these IPASS elements pretty consistently without it having been a formalized structure. So really, I hate mnemonics, you hate mnemonics, we all think they're the devil. But in this instance, I really do, you know, believe that this is probably the best quality mnemonic in use. It is actually the mnemonic that I utilized when I structured the original right handoff tool in Epic. And so this should not be a huge jump for you. But some things like including the illness severity as a drop down list, as it's now included, or allowing that time for feedback and synthesis from the hearer of this information may be a small change. But in general, I think this is a useful tool that can be utilized. There's 10 plus years of data that says it's useful, and I think it's something we can support departmentally. It is a big institutional push to utilize this. I think most importantly, as we approach June and the new interns coming in, this is something that we can incorporate into their um, pre-residency teaching as a part of their orientation so that they have it, you know, just starting from the beginning and they can utilize it and they won't know anything different. So any questions or concerns right now? Okay. I said as it June is going to be upon us soon as and new interns come in June, but also Minneapolis Pride, because I can't not mention our research enterprise and community outreach program, Save the Bottoms. If you are interested in screening gay men for anal cancer on site in Loring Park, June 28th and 29th, Michelle London will, she doesn't know yet, be sending out a link to our sign up sheet. We're always welcoming interns, residents, fellows, medical students. We have a lot of different options for how you can participate and a lot of different times. It does not have to be the whole weekend like I have to be there, but just a few hours of your time could really help make a difference and showcase this department and this institution's commitment to LGBT healthcare. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
You got a preview of our upcoming talk. All right. Well, good morning again. You get me for one more minute before we move on to our speaker. Welcome to the grand rounds portion. Today's speaker is someone who I think defines resilience in my mind and also reminds us that the path to success is not always a straight line, even though it feels like it sometimes when you look at the people around you. Dr. Marta Engelking is one of our PGY5 residents, chief residents this year, and future rural surgeon. And if you look at her now, you might assume that the path here was very smooth. But the truth is, it took an extraordinary amount of courage and effort to keep moving forward when things did not always go as planned. And from scores that didn't tell the full story to potentially not matching the initially to what you thought she wanted to do. The most people would have probably taken that as a stop sign, but Marta saw it as a challenge and she rose to meet it again and again. And through every detour, she is with us here, kept showing up, kept grinding. And now she's about to graduate as one of our strongest surgeons to come through the program and a real, I think, inspiration of those coming behind her. Her CV kind of reads like a surgical adventure guide. If you go dig into it, she's volunteered at Navy ships. She's hiked into rural clinics in Haiti. She somehow also had the opportunity to investigate breast cancer disparities and TBI outcomes, and additionally helped investigate the effects of what happens to surgical residents after 24 hours on call, which I think we can all agree is nothing good. Today, she's going to take on a different kind of health threat other than tired residents, which is one not found in the trauma bay, but in your pantry. Ultra processed foods, the next Surgeon General's warning, which I guess is great news for anyone who made the choice of having a bacon, egg, and cheese today instead of the hummus tray that Michelle put out. So, um, the but beyond the topic of today, just Marta brings, I think, something more powerful, which is, I think, an inspiring example for anyone who's ever been told no, or felt like maybe they didn't, like surgery was particularly early on, not the right path. Um, she is a proof that determination, I think, humility, and showing up every single day matters more than a single test or title. So, thank you, Marta, and I look forward to your talk.
Well, good morning. Dr. Kendrick unfortunately spoiled the news that UPFs stands for ultra processed foods. I purposely didn't include that. I've had several of you ask, what in the heck is a UPF? So I'm glad all of you have at least hopefully learned something, even just from the title of my talk. So hard to believe this day is actually here, but we'll get started. So I have no disclosures, but you will be subject to some unsolicited advice throughout this. What we'll do today is we'll talk about what are ultra processed foods. I'll go through a minor history in food production and sort of what our current food environment is, how this affects our health, but also potentially our surgical patients. And what do we do? Before I go into a little bit of my story and thank yous, and I'll apologize ahead of time for the abundance of photos because my mom has no shortage in the basement for me to spend hours going through. So before we can really understand ultra processed foods, I think it's helpful to evaluate sort of the biological and chemical processes that occur after food is separated from the environment and before they're consumed or used in preparation of meals. So this is the NOVA classification. This comes from the Center for Epidemiological Studies of Health and Nutrition. And then I think this is a helpful way to group foods just based on the extent and purpose of processing that they undergo. So group one are considered unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So this would include fresh fruits and vegetables. They can also be frozen or dried, but essentially anything that's in their natural state. So you've taken it from the ground or an animal and you use it or eat it, consume it in its natural state. Group two are processed culinary ingredients. Ultimately, these are things that you use to then prepare group one foods. So things like syrups, honey, salt, we can make oil from plants and nuts, seeds, those sorts of things. And like I said, then are just used in combination to make and prepare food. Group three are processed foods. Now, these have been around for centuries. Some basic processing are things like canning or undergoing any sort of basic process where we combine things. We can create bread with the simplicity of wheat, flour is your wheat, but yeast, salt, and water. And you can create freshly baked bread. Very different from the bread that you see in the bread aisle, which is a group 4 ultra processed food. So this is essentially everything else that you see in the grocery store. This includes the fatty, like sweet, savory packaged meals, essentially anything that's pre-prepared and ultimately not fresh. So how did we get here? This is actually a quite interesting story. Throughout the 1800s, as we know, this was the Industrial Revolution, and we were able to mass produce food for the first time. Interestingly, in the 1870s, Napoleon had challenged scientists in France to create a long-lasting alternative to butter, and this was to feed his armies and the lower classes. Now, this is how margarine was produced for the first time, through a process similar to the modern ultra-processed foods that we consume today. In the early 20th century, there were breakthroughs in industrial chemistry, and we learned how to make solid fat from cheap oils. These were things from coconut oil, ground nuts, palm oil, those sorts of things, in addition to waste materials from factories. So cottonseed is a major contributor to this advancement. It was mostly considered waste. but there was an abundance of it, and so they were determined to find a way to make it profitable. They found they could make an oil from the cottonseed, but unfortunately it tasted horrible and turned out to be toxic to men's fertility. Now, in fact, I found a quote from Popular Science Monthly. This was from 1894 that I think really speaks to the picture of how drastic these advances were. And it goes like this: what was garbage in 1860 was a fertilizer in 1870, cattle food in 1880, and table food by 1890. So pretty drastic changes in terms of what people are consuming during that time. Now, Procter and Gamble, so William Procter partnered with James Gamble and formulated what's now known as Procter and Gamble, which you probably recognize. And they were actually able to take cottonseed and create or reduce the cost of soap, which ultimately then turned into a way to make cottonseed edible. So they developed Crisco. Essentially, as we know, sort of a fake lard that was at that time made from detoxified cottonseed. And they found that you could render almost any substance into sort of a uniform bland powder, and then it can be usable in just about anything. Ultimately, a lot of these examples include things like sugar shortages from World War I, which led to the first artificial sweetener, saccharin, which is the pink little packet of Sweet and Low that some people still use today. And then in the 1920s, we had butter that was actually made from paraffin, a byproduct of coal. So throughout these decades, we've been able to create thousands of ultra-processed food that all stemmed from a waste material from back in the 1800s. So how are they really made today? UPFs are made from crops. They're grown on a large scale, and we essentially live off of four main products. There's rice, corn, soy, and wheat. So as the crop is broken down into powders, they're separated from fat, protein, and carbohydrates. And the powders have a nearly infinite shelf life. So they can be shipped all over the world. To make things edible again, you take the powder and you mix it with things like meat and thousands of additives to create a shelf-stable product. So essentially everything on the inside shelves at the grocery store would be considered this type of product. They will emulsify and stabilize the product and then extrude it into a shape or texture. So once you strip the crops into these powders and reformulate them, you can essentially create anything that you want. A great example is a potato. So you can eat a potato whole. You take it from the ground, you bake it, and it's in its most natural form, right? All you've really done is heat it to make it edible. Now, a minimally processed version of this would be something where you slice your potato really thin and you just throw it in some oil and essentially fry it at home to make your own little potato crisps, which I can attest are fantastic, or in the oven. Or ultra processed, where you pick up a potato chip and you think you're eating a potato, but really there's no nutritional value to that. It's not actually a potato anymore. It's made from a powder to then be formulated into something that looks like a potato. So interestingly, while all this was happening through the process of creating ultra-processed foods, there was development and regulation, and then also a major shift in the food industry itself. So in 1906, the FDA organized the Wiley Act, which was actually named after a chemist who was concerned about the additives that we were putting in our food and felt like there should be more regulation. By 1958, they created a designation for all of these substances and additives called GRAS, which stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. Now, if you consider trans fats that were in Crisco, these were considered safe and added as a compound in our food for a very long time, because things could either be studied or they could be added to our food because they don't have any known risk. And so what happened is over decades, we start to find sort of retrospectively that things are actually much less healthy than we anticipated. Crisco had trans fats that we found to be extremely unhealthy for our own heart health. And so in 1990, they changed the regulation completely, and you actually can't have trans fat in Crisco anymore. So it does lead to changes within our system. That being said, by 1997, they couldn't keep up with the number of additives that companies were submitting to be included in our food. And so they essentially created a law where the FDA allowed companies to self-determine if a patient was or if a substance was considered safe. And so what happened was companies were not required to disclose this information. It was their option. Self-disclosure was something that essentially went to the wayside. At the end of all of this, when you think about the late 70s and the early 2000s, I think this is when things definitely took a large turn. At that time, there were two men within the tobacco food industry that actually started to shape the production there were two men that essentially took over the industry in order to save their own companies. So these two men were Morris and Reynolds. They owned Marlboro and Camel Tobacco. And this was around the time that the Surgeon's General warning came out on tobacco and smoking. So there was a huge drop in sales, and they essentially said, we need to find some way to make profit. And so they purchased Kraft and Nabisco. And they sort of were the masterminds of engineering the ultra processed food market at that time. Now, we're all familiar with the big tobacco tactics and how they were able to hook smokers. Well, they translated these strategies to get Americans hooked on ultra processed foods in order to maximize their own consumption and profit. So by 1989, over 50% of profits from these two companies were from the sale of food. And by 2018, all these other companies had to compete with them. And so over 70% of our branded food products were qualified as ultra processed foods. In addition, a major strategy included creating chemicals that made our food hyper palatable. And so this was another way that all the companies had to essentially jump on the bandwagon in order to compete with them. Now, when it comes to the addictive nature of food, we know there's evidence to support the mechanism by which this hijacks our system. So again, non-hyperpalatable foods would be considered your NOVA classification 1 and 2. They occur naturally in nature. Now, our brains are wired to eat bright, colorful foods because they typically are high in nutrient quality. And this is an evolutionary process to promote survival. The problem is with hyperpalatable foods. By adding these chemicals, we're essentially activating the brain's reward system and creating this highly rewarding experience. And so on top of that, you have slow engagement of the physiological satiety mechanisms, where when you eat, it's not telling you that you're full. And so we have a tendency to overeat pre-prepared foods. These also happen to be high in fat, sodium, and carbohydrates. So how does this really affect us? As we know, the dopamine circle is hard to break, and your body craves sweet, sugary foods because it's an easy source of energy. We used to use that for, hunting or running from a bear, but through evolution, what's happened now is we take in certain substances that are contained within ultra-processed foods, and it causes us to crave more in order to seek that same reward. So this becomes a cumulative and circular effect with ultra-processed foods. As you can imagine, you combine this with a lack of nutrients and a lack of satiety, and it leads to overeating and weight gain. So all of this to say is, I think it's important to recognize the addictive nature of these substances, and that it's not all about self-control and genetics. Some of this is really driven by the food itself. So where are we now? About 73% of the food supply in the US is categorized as ultra processed, and it makes up about 70% of our overall consumed diet. There is a lot of evidence to support the link between consuming ultra processed foods and obesity. This is a randomized controlled trial through the NIH that was published back in 2018. This is a cross-sectional study where there was a group of people who spent 30 days contained 24/7. They were randomized to two arms. Half ate ultra-processed foods for 2 weeks. The other half ate unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And then they switched for the second 2 weeks. Both groups had access to 5,000 calories a day and could eat whatever they wanted. So more food than you could possibly ever want. They had the same content of salt, fat, sugar, carbohydrates, and glycemic load. and they were both considered equally delicious. So they actually had focus groups and um, ultimately validated each diet just to make sure that they were equally as pleasant. So what they found was consuming ultra processed foods, in those consuming ultra processed foods ate about 500 calories more per day and had about a kilogram weight loss over those 2 weeks. That's the blue line here on the graph. Then you have the ultra processed food group, which of course had a less caloric intake and about a kilogram weight loss. I think this suggests that the excess consumption is likely driven by something within the chemicals and additives that are within the diet, and of course the lack of satiety that we mentioned. And while I recognize it's difficult to prove correlation versus causation in these instances, I think this reveals a really strong association. And with the knowledge that we have on ultra processed foods and hyperpalatable foods, I think it's a pretty easy conclusion in general. Ultimately, I think it's just proof that not all calories are created equal. I think if you compare 25 grams of carbohydrates in fresh fruit, it's very different than 25 grams of carbohydrates from a bag of potato chips. So where has this led us? If we look back in the 1990s, there wasn't one state in the US that had obesity prevalence over 25%. But now as a country, as you can see on the far right, we're up to 30 to 40% in both men and women. In the last 1 to 2 years, there's some data to say that this has maybe started to plateau, but it's an alarming number nonetheless. In addition, as many as 1 in 5 children and teens have obesity, which I don't think we can ignore. If you look at the rise of ultra processed foods in our diet in correlation to the rate of obesity, sugar intake, this actually coincides with the increase in TV ads and marketing as our media and the way that we communicate has also changed. And I think this is also something that plays a major role in our food environment. If I could, I'd probably show you all a picture or a video of like Tony the Tiger. He's like skateboarding and he's like, they're great, because it's what draws kids to want to eat certain breakfast cereals in the morning. So I think that that's a great way or a great pictorial of what that really meant for us growing up. Now, on top of hijacking the brain's reward system and leading to obesity, we know that ultra processed foods also has other detrimental effects. They change our gut microbiome. They cause intestinal permeability, leading to inflammation and infection, as well as stimulate the pro-inflammatory pathway, leading to chronic disease such as diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. Poor diet has officially overtaken tobacco as the leading cause of early death related to dietary non-communicable diseases. This is a systemic analysis from the Lancet in 2019, which evaluated the overall global burden of disease impacts from non-communicable disease, morbidity, and mortality. On the left, you can see the diet that is consumed, and then each shade of red is one of the non-communicable diseases listed as separated as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and other causes. And you can see there's a clear relation between the type of diet consumed and the rate of morbidity and mortality. And of course, highest among those heavy with ultra processed foods. So how does this relate to the surgical patient? We know that surgery is stressful and causes inflammation. The stress of surgery triggers the release of catecholamines and cortisol. There's an increase in blood flow and vascular permeability, and then of course the upregulation of inflammatory mediators. The body's attempting to find a balance between pro and anti-inflammation in order to resolve tissue repair. So what if our patients are in a chronically inflamed state already due to a diet that's high in ultra processed foods? So if you think about it, if over 70% of our patients are consuming ultra processed foods for at least 2/3 of their diet, we know they must be in a chronic pro-inflammatory state. This would also classify them as malnourished with chronic micronutrient deficiencies. So typically we think about this as our acutely ill patient in the ICU, but really what this means is that this also includes our elective patients and those that we see in the clinic. So we know that poor nutrition has negative impacts on surgical outcomes. Patients are at higher risk of infection. They have a weakened immune system. They have delays in wound healing. They have a longer hospital stay, they have higher readmission rates, and an overall increase in morbidity and mortality. So when you leave here, I urge you to consider including a diet history when talking to your patients. Try to make time to counsel them on their pre-op diet, ways that they can optimize their own outcomes in both short and long term. Because I think this will be a huge part of the future of improving surgical outcomes. Interestingly, there is minimal to no research looking at how a pre-op diet will affect elective surgical patients. Again, as I mentioned, we think about this with our critical ICU patients and how important nutrition is to getting them through their hospitalization and getting them to heal. But what if we could reduce the rate of anastomotic leaks by optimizing our patient's diet prior to a big colon surgery? And so I think this is something that would be a really interesting topic to dive into. What do I think needs to be done when it comes to our food environment itself? Well, I think fresh food needs to be more accessible and more affordable. We know that poor nutrition affects those in low socioeconomic status to a greater extent. And nutrient-dense natural foods are significantly more expensive than ultra-processed foods. I think there needs to be a reform in agriculture and a push towards healthy food. If we incentivize farms to diversify their crops and provide subsidies in order towards healthy foods themselves, that will reduce the expense of eating true natural healthy foods. I think it's important that we think about how we eat and we normalize a family dinner again, where people aren't sitting on their cell phones and distracted by TV, but just a thoughtful, wholesome meal that family puts together in a combined fashion. And then I think there is a role for better regulation in food marketing and labels, as well as the additives and the production of food itself. I think there's been a lot of media attention about food in other countries, and while I do think there's a regulatory gap in the US, I think ultimately it doesn't really matter, because if it's an ultra processed food, it doesn't matter what additives or chemicals in it. It's not going to have the same nutritional value as what something from the ground or an animal is going to give you. So I think that's just something to think about in terms of, what can be done to the food environment itself. Now, what can you and I do? This is where my unsolicited advice sort of comes in for each one of you here today. So I think start reading nutrition labels. You'd be very surprised when you take the time to turn a box over and read through the ingredients when you see something that you've never heard of, or it sounds like it came right out of the chemistry lab. Because if it's not directly from the ground or again from an animal, that's probably where it came from. EWG is the Environmental Working Group. This is a QR code here that actually links you to an article that talks about the top 12 chemicals to avoid in your foods. But their website offers a wealth of information on not just foods, but also other chemicals and toxins that will affect your body in personal or cleaning products. And so if you're interested at all, I definitely urge you to just take a look. And then swap out processed foods for healthier but still satisfying foods. I think, this will help you to slowly accumulate better habits. An example is that instead of buying an ultra processed yogurt that has gelatin and fake fruit at the bottom, you can grab Greek yogurt, put your own fresh or frozen fruit and some honey in it, prepare it ahead of time, and it's the same thing. Only it actually has good nutritional value to it. I've started making my own sourdough, so if any of you are interested, I would be happy to share my starter. I have an abundance and would be happy to share my recipes with you. And then, reach for the most wholesome version of whatever it is you want. So you're like, oh gosh, an apple juice sounds great right now. Well, apple juice, for example, causes a sharp spike in your glucose, right? But an apple doesn't have the same effect. When you chew an apple, the process of your body breaking that down stimulates the physiological processes within our body, and you feel full longer. And so just think about, okay, well, instead of this processed version, is there a healthier version that I could choose? And then ultimately get in the habit of just shopping the perimeter of the grocery store. I think people have talked about this for a really long time, just because it's the location that you're going to find the most nutrient dense food. And then using that food to actually prepare your meals at home. Last is my personal favorite. It's the 80-20 rule because none of us are perfect. I think in the current environment, it is nearly impossible to completely eliminate ultra processed foods, particularly for a surgeon or a surgery resident. If you're here in the middle of the night, it's you have Cheerios and milk, or you have the leftover coma roll in the physician lounge. Doesn't really leave you much options. And so just give yourself some grace. It's okay to indulge in these things. It's not something that is completely avoidable, nor should we. Eating out at restaurants are opportunities for us to engage with our friends and our family. And you're not going to be able to control all of these things. And so I think just having a goal in mind to say 80% of the time, I make my own meals, we prepare it at home, we eat wholesome meals, and 20% of the time, do what you want. You know, if you want to have a donut on Tuesday morning, I do it too. It's just a great kind of rule of thumb, I think, to just set a goal for yourself, to try to just think about that on a more routine basis. So with that, I'll go into a bit of my history. So I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, to my mom, Susan, and dad, John. I have an older brother, Zach, and a younger sister, Katie. We lived in Stillwater throughout my childhood, which is an amazing town. If you haven't visited it already, I highly suggest it. We spent our summers up at the cabin, which is really only about 20 minutes from where I'll be practicing now. We had a big group of neighborhood kids who all grew up together. Rain or shine, we always found a way to have a good time. I love to fish, but as you can see, I grew up and got bigger, but the fish stayed the same size. My mom worked in pharmaceutical sales and then ultimately decided to stay home with us kids after I was born. My dad was an orthopedic surgeon, now retired, but this was a formative part of my childhood. Take Your Daughter to Work Day was my favorite day of the year. And as you can see, he taught me how to hold the knife to carve pumpkins at a very early age. These are my godparents in the middle, Jim and Betty. Unfortunately, we lost them more recently. These are my grandparents, my dad's mom and dad, and my mom's mom and dad. And then my grandma Gerd is actually still living. She's 102, and this is 4 generations with my mom and my niece. I began dancing at the age of 5. My mom brought me to the local Nutcracker, and I told her, I want to do that. And so that began my 20 plus year career in dance. I think I tried every other sport imaginable, but with 5 to 6 days of a week training in Russian ballet, I just didn't have time. I started as a winter fairy in the Nutcracker, and for my last show, I was the Snow Queen. But to this day, I think I could still perform the entire ballet from start to finish. My mom was sort of the oil and grease that kept me going, and if it wasn't for her, there's no way I would have been able to be this committed. I did branch into other genres with the high school dance team with things like jazz, plum, and hip hop throughout college and thereafter. This included traveling for world's competitions, coaching 2 local dance teams, and professionally dancing with the Minnesota Vikings. I didn't go far for undergrad. I studied biology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul here. I met an amazing group of friends whom I'm fortunate to continue to have close by, and were able to sort of catch up right where we left off. During my time at St. Thomas, I had the opportunity to study abroad for a semester in Australia. While there, I did not shy away from any sort of adventure. I traveled to New Zealand and Fiji. I skied the Southern Alps. I went skydiving over the Great Barrier Reef. We went whitewater rafting, and I even climbed to the top of the Sydney Bridge. My time at St. Thomas also sparked my interest in global outreach. I spent a J term in Uganda working with a local seminary. We built a pig pen as a means of income for their community. I went on to serve with Community Health Initiative and traveled to Haiti to provide basic care for diabetes and hypertension. And then just before residency, I traveled to Peru with Scalpels of the Cross to provide orthopedic surgical care. And this was my first opportunity to really see how prolonged relationships with the local community could really have an impact on surgical care, very similar to the situation that you see discussed with Dr. Tuttle. Towards the end of my time at St. Thomas, I met my now husband, Dan. In fact, I had just returned from 35 hours of traveling home from Uganda and had some friends who were insisted we get together. But Dan and I met at Stella's, which it's a restaurant that unfortunately is now closed, but that was sort of an icon in our relationship. Before we met, I had always planned on naming a dog, a golden retriever, who was going to be the runt, Stella. And this is Stella right here. She is the aunt to Buddha on the left. The two of them are kind of two peas in a pod, but I don't get to claim any credit for their good behavior or just kind of their personalities in general, but they're the absolute best. My husband trained and take care of them, so I just get to love on them. Almost immediately after we got married, we packed up and moved away to Dominica. This was, of course, before we had the pups, but Dominica, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic. Many people think that Dominica and the Dominican Republic are the same thing. They're not. I attended Ross University. This red arrow actually shows our apartment, which was on the ocean next to campus. This was one of my microbiology professors, and she actually taught my dad microbiology at the University of Minnesota Duluth. So it's interesting how things go full circle. You can travel halfway across the world to go to medical school and have the same professors as your own family did back home. We stayed in the Caribbean for the full 16 months. Our family came to visit and we sort of traveled the area, but then we returned to the States for my step one and clinicals. This moved us all over, but mostly Florida and Chicago before I had to travel alone for sub-Is as along my fourth year. The top right is a picture of after my first ED thoracotomy at Mount Sinai in Chicago, which further confirmed my decision to go into surgery. We did have a few breaks in training. As Dr. Kendrick mentioned, my route was a bit circuitous when it comes to education. So Dan and I took every opportunity we could to travel. This was initially sparked by my studying abroad, but now Dan and I have been all over the world, backpacking for up to 7 weeks at a time. We've now traveled to 20 countries together, and we're planning our next adventure for this summer. So I'm very excited for that. Dan has been my rock throughout residency, and if it wasn't for him, I'd be lying in a pile of dirty clothes, no clean dishes, no healthy food in the house. But instead, I get to come home. I'll sleep 8 hours every night. I'm not on call, and I don't have to worry about the little things. So really, he deserves an extra thank you. Officially in 2019 is when I began my journey here as a prelim with the class in the top left. I cannot thank the department enough for the opportunity to be able to stay and complete my training here. The resident mentorship program was key in my prelim year. And for those of you who haven't had the privilege of working with Dr. Robbins, this is her down in the middle. I hear you'll be fortunate enough to have her back as staff next year. I've sort of become the resident that doesn't really have a class because I've jumped around 3 different times. So this pictorial sort of illustrates my journey leading up to my current co-chiefs here in the bottom right, whom I've really come to appreciate the ability to just talk through cases in tough times and then laugh at the 65 messages I have on my phone in our text chain when you get out of a long case. So thank you, because this has been a really great year. And lastly, of course, I want to thank all the staff that has devoted their time and energy to developing the strength of our program. I started at the VA as a prelim, and several staff there were instrumental in just the beginning of my journey and not knowing where or if I would match. North Memorial has become more prominent in our training, but I especially want to thank Dr. Davis, Dr. Ramaka, Dr. Nugent, and Dr. Janabzadeh for their mentorship there. I feel like I have a special place in my heart for Regions and Methodists because with the amount of time that we spend in these 2 hospitals, this is where we really grow up as surgeons. Once you're a chief at Regions, you start to feel like a junior staff and really develop relationships with the surgeons that reflect that. And so I'm really excited to be able to have them on the other line of the phone and have this connection when I have referrals from my practice. I especially want to thank Dr. Wolper, Dr. Haas, and Dr. Fox, who really helped prepare me for starting a community practice. But to all the EGS trauma surgeons, in particular, Dr. Blee, Dr. Yeha, Dr. Keck, Dr. Shika, Dr. Lyle, Dr. Meyer, and Dr. Tomlinson, who really shaped my experience. And thanks to them, I will not have to shy away from the EGS gallbladder. And at Methodist, all of the ACS staff and the community general surgeons, I really appreciated spending time in their OR and helping me solidify my choice in community general surgery and just the overwhelming amount of support that they provided. And of course, last but certainly not least, our mothership of the University of Minnesota, the pediatric surgery team. I think, the attention to detail and feedback that we receive on this rotation allows to see ourselves grow as surgeons. I had to put this photo of Dr. Hess up because it's proof that he smiles. And I think this was after he saw that I flicked my tail to the working side and realized that I remembered that. And so just a little fun fact. And then, of course, the obligatory photo with Dr. Segura's OR where, we had just eaten Panera. And then, as Chesney says, we tie an eye knot or an air knot and then go cry. But all things in all seriousness, the challenge on this rotation is 100% worth it. And it's truly a pleasure to learn from them. Here on East Bank, as you can see, we rotate with no shortage of excellent surgeons. And while many of these rotations are for short periods of time, I find it really meaningful when you can walk into the physician lounge and a staff from intern year will recognize you and ask you how things are going. So I think it just speaks to their commitment to teaching us residents, even if it's only for a short time. The thoracic team played a strong role in my match here as a prelim, and so I can't thank them enough for just being some of my strongest advocates. The surgeon team, I'm really sad I only had the pleasure to rotate as a chief because I feel like this rotation is invaluable and oftentimes overlooked. And thank you, Dr. Vasevich, for sort of taking me under your wing. I spent extra time with MAS, and Dr. Leslie jokes that I should have a fellowship certified at this point because I've now been on their service 3 or 4 times because of my prelim year. And then I spent, of course, the last 6 years getting to know the EGS and critical care staff. And, I am really excited to have EGS as my last rotation of chief here because I think it'll be the perfect send-off. Many of you that I've gotten to know, Dr. Beelman, Dr. Brunsvold, Dr. Chipman, Dr. Granja, within the department, Dr. Kendrick, Dr. Liu, Dr. Martin, Dr. Deaton, and Dr. McEachran. I think, I've spent most of my time with you guys, and I think that, graduating and going into practice, I get to learn from some of the best. So I'm very excited that next year I will be joining St. Croix Health in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin. It's about an hour northeast of here on the St. Croix River. These are my future partners who have already been instrumental in creating a smooth transition, which I'm grateful for. And I look forward to having all of my mentors so close here because you're only a phone call away, and my patients can also reach you, and I can trust that when I transfer my patients, I know exactly who they're going to. So I'm excited to have those connections, and I hope you've all learned something today, and that's something you can take with you, but just know that I've learned just as much from you, both the staff and the residents. So thank you.
Thank you, Marta. It's been an honor to get to know you, to get to work with you, and everything I've done. Real inspiration to all those kind of things. And I did have the yogurt parfait with full.
It's my go-to. Although Michelle's choice in the hummus bowls this morning couldn't have come at a better time.
What's that, Michelle?
Yeah, it's actually Melissa Brunsvold and Dr. Jones sitting together. This was a really great talk. I would like to ask you about what you think we can do about the ultra processed foods. For example, when I was a trainee in Detroit, there is actually no grocery store within the city limits of Detroit. So proving your point about how low income people are often only given ultra processed foods as an option. So commonly our patients would say that, they stopped at McDonald's for a dozen, dollar burgers, 99-cent burgers. That was the family meal for the day. So what do you think we can do what are the next steps from a social standpoint to try to bring healthier food to our inner cities? I think that's my first question. Then I have another comment at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think it's not only inner city, but also something that I saw in terms of food deserts that exist in places like the Navajo, where I rotated in Shiprock. It's the same sort of situation. They actually have a pretty barren grocery store. It's there, but there's nothing really in it. It's only stocked with ultra processed foods. A major part of that, I think, is partly from our policy in terms of like SNAP and food stamps that only covers certain food, and they've changed a lot of that with regulation, but ultimately it's still, I think, the cost of things, because the cost of healthier foods is so much more expensive. So then when you're trying to feed a family of 5, 6, 7, you really can't afford to buy the more expensive healthier foods. You're sort of forced to buy the ultra processed foods. I think a lot of it is going to have to come from the top down in both affordability, but then the actual stocking, because there should be no reason that an inner city doesn't have a grocery store that has ultimately options other than ultra processed food.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just wanted to echo Dr. Kendrick's comments about the grit and determination that you have shown. I remember back from, intern orientation, having to just kind of say, hey, we need to let some of the other people answer some of these questions. I think you have made the most of your education, every opportunity you've been given. You have just grabbed the bull by the horns and really made the most of every opportunity. And yeah, the path wasn't, maybe what you had hoped to start with, but you really made the most of it and have become, somebody that I point to, and that we all look at when we're talking to people about, does this ever work? Can you ever make it? And yeah, if you really take responsibility for your own education as you have done. You're a model to me and everybody else for how to make the most of the opportunities you've been given and really keep, your feet driving and moving forward, and to be just wildly successful. So I'm really proud of you, and I think you are a great example of a successful surgeon in our program. Thank you for choosing us.
Goes both ways. Thank you.
Marta, it's been a pleasure working with you. I'm a little disappointed there aren't more photos of your dancing time with the mic.
A lot of them are not appropriate for this.
Oh. You talk a little bit about people's knowledge about how to cook. How does that play into this?
Certainly. I think a lot of this has come from just the efficiency of grabbing something quick. So that's, I think, what really led to like TV dinners in the 90s, right? Families would just throw a frozen dinner in, it's pre-prepared, it's easy. And so I think through the last few generations, we've lost some of the education in how to cook. I mean, I can remember some of the favorite days, like we'd make blueberry pancakes at the cabin and I'd be stirring the batter with mom. And, I just don't think families really have, one, the time to do that, nor sort of the education that gets passed along to the next generation. And so, even my husband will say, I want to become a better cook. Like, I just never really learned. And so I think it's just something that we have to make normalized again, similar to what I meant in terms of like sitting down and having a meal as a family, to make time for that, because it's really, really important. And then incorporating the actual preparation of the meal as a part of that.
One thing that I've learned lately, sometimes you have to cook in a hurry, and I worry I might have to do other things, get ready to work, and for maybe an evening shift, and I worry the water might boil down, or I have to stir it, or I have to look at it. But I just cut up the vegetables, put it in a great big bowl that would otherwise be for making bread, put it in the microwave for 30 minutes. I can take a shower. It sits in there, and all of a sudden, the beets, the potatoes, the corn, everything that's in there is cooked. I put a little turmeric in, a little ginger, and I could have made it on the stove, but it's safer.
Mm-hmm. And a crock pot or Instapot are fantastic options to be able to just throw something in the morning and leave it, or even the night before. You can leave things on warm for however long you want. So,
Yeah, correct, Bob. Another good.
Dr. Meyer, Patrick.
Just in the last week, I was reading an article that those class one foods, the nutritional value has plummeted since the 50s. And they were attributing it to sort of mass farming and just you get your crops out quickly, you grow them quickly, you treat it with a bunch of chemicals. Do you know of any studies saying that buying from the little moms and pops local place actually gives you better nutrition? And I'll end with, I certainly look forward to the next year hearing from you on the phone and knowing that you're sending something to us that it actually needed to come over.
I promise I will. So to answer your question about the nutrient value, that's really interesting. I haven't looked at that specifically. I have looked at the important foods that matter when it comes to organic versus non-organic, just because of the amount of pesticides and toxins that are used in mass farming these days. I think no matter what, it's going to be healthier to buy from a farmer that you know. We buy meat from a farmer that pasture raises their cows, they're grass fed. There's, they don't use antibiotic, like all of those things, you can think about. But I think if having your own garden is going to be the most nutrient dense because you know the soil, you know where it's coming from. And so while I don't know that it's studied, I think there's definitely truth to that.
Go ahead.
How do you recommend physicians address also the cultural differences in food? As a Mexican American, eliminating tortillas completely from my diet would be very difficult, and asking my dad to do that would be impossible. So but tortillas are made from masa, which I'm sure is ultra processed at this point in time. Back in the day, it was probably more processed when they were hand grinding the corn. And then also uses lard, which is also going to be at least very processed, or the class 3 or 4 at this point too. So how do we kind of address that?
So I would say it's about how you prepare it. So for example, lard is not necessarily a bad thing. So I take tallow from the beef that I get from the farmer and I boil it down to make tallow to cook with. And you use it as a butter or an oil to saute your vegetables, whatever. It gives it fantastic flavor and it's way better for you than something that's going to be ultra processed. So I think it depends where you get the ingredients that you're going to cook from. Taking away your culture is not the point, right? I think that's part of what's so important is that we engage. Food is such a major component of our social aspect of beings. And so, I think it's important to keep those. But ultimately, I think just thinking about how you prepare it. You can actually make sourdough discard tortillas too. And I'll bring you some. You can try them and see what you think.
First of all, I want to say it's been really great training with you, our intern year and now our chief years. Intern year, I was secretly always happy when I did have to follow you on the rotation because it set the bar so high. So it's been really great. And then my question for you is, how do you work in some of this education for your patients on dietary choices, especially within the inpatient setting when the food served to them by the hospital is probably more in that UPF food. So how do you start this conversation? How do you recommend that?
Yeah, so I guess sort of to piggyback on even something that you said is if you look at the hospital food that we provide and half of the refrigerators are sodas and, high sugar things, I think that in and of itself is a whole nother step to try to make changes. But I think, that's something that I've struggled with, especially now thinking about how I'm going to be helping my own patients in the future. I think I'll be able to dictate that a little bit more in my own practice. As a resident, we're just running around constantly, and I feel like you don't have as much time with your patients. And so I'll be able to, again, dictate my time a little bit better, or just differently as a staff. And so I think it's just something that I'm still working in how that's, what that's going to look like at this point. But, a lot of that also too is then depending on, what sort of comorbidities your patient has coming in. Oftentimes you can get an idea even, on paper, kind of what kind of food choices people are making coming in. So just things to think about. Yeah.
Marta, that was a great talk. Last year, Matt Wheelwright could not convince me to not eat meat, but you have convinced me to cut out some UPFs. Figure out how. But really, I really enjoyed working with you as an intern and a 3 on thoracic, and now being co-chiefs together. It's been really fun. I think you're a real testament to our program, being able to graduate and go straight into practice. So I'm excited to see how your year goes. The years to follow.
Dr. Segura is Dr. Segura.
Yeah. Marta, good morning. And yeah, I agree with Chesney's comments. Hope you can hear me okay. But congrats to one of Stillwater's finest for the group. I think my wife's mom and Marta's mom were in Bridge Club together or something like that. So it's good to see a local successful product. You've done a remarkable job. The teaching today was convicting, profound. I feel like I need to stop at Chick-fil-A and Panera, maybe a little bit less. That may be hard to do for
No,
team
we still
building.
want them there.
Yeah. But way to go. Really appreciate your enthusiasm, just the way you always smiled and you just were so caring about our patients. You've done a beautiful job. Looking forward to seeing you continue to grow. Congratulations.
Marta, we're interns together, and kind of like what Emily said, you were clearly this just star intern, and it's been such a joy to watch you go through and to try and emulate you and your work ethic and your positive attitude, and especially coming back to fourth year and you were a rising chief, giving me advice of kind of just how to approach rotations, and you've been a really great mentor, honestly, and friend.
Thank you.
Marta, I wanted to get the name of your cattle farmer. I bought a chest freezer and now I'm looking for ways to fill it.
100%. I can help you fill that.
I would make a quick plug, echoing what Dr. Meyer said, as far as residency goes and practical, like, getting more class 1 foods and also like not losing your mind as a resident. I do a lot of farmers market shopping in the summer when I can, and I find that it lasts longer because it's picked much fresher than like the grocery store. So I waste less food by buying it at the farmers market, and I think it's probably, priced about the same, if I had to guess, as the grocery store, and the carbon footprint's lower.
Plus, then you're supporting local and not the big box stores, which I think is also fantastic.
Awesome talk, Marta. My first weekend of residency, I was the intern that got blessed with the Friday night call shift and the Sunday call shift. And I was like, I don't know how the hell I'm supposed to do this. But on that Sunday call shift, you, Nivi, Dr. Dean, and I went and got breakfast at the graduate hotel. We literally paused all clinical work and went and got breakfast. And I thought, this seems not right. but as we were sitting there, you were talking about how you were interviewing for jobs and everything. And I'm sitting there stunned that I was able to let my pager just sit there. And I talked to my mom later that night. She's like, "How was your first week of residency?" And I said, "It was hard. I have no idea what I'm doing. But I had breakfast with one of my chiefs. She's interviewing for jobs." And I was like, "I'm going to be fine." Like, she is, the way that she's talking about navigating residency and the job market, I'm like, she's brilliant. And so I think about that, and now I know where you signed on for your job. So it's really encouraging for me. And also a comment about your presentation. I feel like the UPFs and processed foods are at a time right now that they might be more encouraged because we have alternatives to weight loss in our health with medications like GLP-1s. GLP-1s are amazing. People lose weight, they have a decreased risk in their cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but it might give you a license to continue to have bad habits of a Western diet. And so I think we are in a frontier where things are going to be challenging because we have these, I guess, masks to the issues that we have with our diet. And so it's going to be something that will be a bit of a barrier as we try to eat healthier and encourage healthier eating. It's something that I think about. But,
Absolutely.